Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Last time we met, we talked about the development of classical Greek civilization. Now we move on to another topic, the Greek Polis. On to the essential question. So what are we going to be looking at here today in the screencast? First, we're going to talk about the polis. Now, if you know anything about Greece, you've probably heard of this before. What is a polis anyway? That's the first question that we'll address. And what are some of the basic characteristics of this Greek polis thing? Once we've had a chance to take a look at the Greek polis, we're going to see how after the end of the Greek Dark Age, the Greek polises began to establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean Sea region. Well, why did they establish these colonies throughout the region? And how did these Greek colonies impact the culture of the entire ancient world? How did these colonies lead to the spread of Greek culture and language throughout the Mediterranean Sea region? And the last subtopic that we'll look at here today is economics, politics, struggle, and change. And that's really like all of history anyway. But in terms of what we're looking at here, we want to see how did economic problems lead to struggle and conflict between the aristocracy and the common people in Greece. We'll see how the common people managed to use the most unlikely of sources, a new military tactic called the phalanx, in order to gain greater political rights and freedoms in their polises. So what's a polis? Why did the Greeks colonize? And what does this phalanx thing have to do with getting greater political rights? Onward and upward. Let's begin. So as we learned last time, the Greeks never united into one country. The geography kept them isolated. And so instead of becoming one single united nation, Greece became a patchwork of these little city-states. A city-state is basically a city that is its own independent kingdom or state, hence the name city-state. This is what the Greeks called the polis. Thus, instead of one single united Greek nation, the polis becomes the basic political unit of ancient Greece. A city-state, a polis, it literally is just a city that is its own independent kingdom. It consists of the city itself, as well as the land surrounding it and any additional land or villages that the polis tends to control. When we take a look at the map here on the right-hand side, we can see some of the major polises that dot the Greek world. There's a number of minor ones. Those are just some of the big guys there. But this is your basic political unit of Greece. I mean, when you talk about Greek history, you talk about Athens, you talk about Sparta, you talk about Thebes. These are polises. And throughout Greece, the polis shares a pretty common set of physical characteristics, no matter where you go. The most easily discernible defining characteristic of a polis is here. It's called the Acropolis. Harkening back to the old days of the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Acropolis was sort of a fortified hilltop citadel, around which the entire polis was constructed. Down below the Acropolis, you have the marketplace, or what they called the Agora. The Agora was a big wide open space. This is sort of like the downtown of the polis, where you would have the marketplace, the temples, the seat of government. This is kind of where the action happens. And then outside the walls of the polis, you have the surrounding farmlands and villages that are controlled by said polis. It reminds you an awful lot of any sort of city or metro area that we have in the modern United States today, where you have the very obvious architectural things that become the image of that city, much like the Acropolis of Athens was for that city. You've got the downtown area and its surrounding metro area, and it speaks an awful lot to who we are as human beings, that model hasn't changed a whole lot in thousands of years. Now, let's say you live in the polis. We have a number of Greek polises, many of them rivaled, so war was a very common occurrence. The army of each polis was made up of citizen soldiers. What this means is that every citizen served in the army when called upon. Which brings us to a better question. In Greece, then, what is a citizen? It's not quite the same as it is here in the United States. You see, in ancient Greece, to be a citizen, 1, you had to be a man. 2, you had to be born in that polis. And 3, you had to own land. So if you could meet that 3-part litmus test, you were a citizen. A man born in the polis who owned land. Now, that ended up excluding about 80% of the population of any polis. Usually, only about 20% of people who lived in a polis would have met the standards to become a citizen. That's going to be important a little bit later on, by the way. Now, military tactics of the day leaned very, very heavily on the use of cavalry. As such, cavalry was the most important part of the army of any polis. And so when you think about cavalry, you think horses. It's horseback or chariot soldiers. And this stuff is expensive. War during this time period and many time periods is a rich man's game. To be in the cavalry, you had to afford horses, you had to afford the armor, you had to afford the equipment, the weapons. And if you think about it, who are the folks that can afford this stuff? The wealthy. The aristocracy, the wealthy nobles of the polis. They were the only ones who could afford to fight in the cavalry. And since the cavalry was the most important part of the military and the aristocrats were the cavalry, they were the most important people in the army. And the aristocrats, this gave them a huge amount of prestige, power, and control in the polis. So because the aristocracy were wealthy enough to be the cavalry, this allowed them to be the most important and powerful people in the polis. Remember that? That's going to be important a little bit later on in the back end of our presentation here. So if we recall, after the Dorians came in and took over, Greece went into a dark age. The dark ages finally end. That's fantastic. We're happy. And when the dark ages come to a close, we see economic prosperity returning to Greece. And good economic times tend to lead to population increases. People have more money, there's more food to go around, you have more babies, populations go up. That's just kind of the way that it works. Bad economic times tend to see population contractions. Anyway. The Dark Ages are over, prosperity is returning to Greece, the population's increasing. But if we remember from last time, Greece does not have a whole lot of good farmland. 3/4 of the mainland is low-lying mountains. That doesn't make for a lot of good fertile farmland. So you do the math here, guys. You have a growing population, you have a scarce amount of farmland, and that's going to equal not enough land to grow enough crops to feed the growing population. We're going to have a scarcity of food. There's not enough food to go around to feed the new growing population in Greece. But don't worry, Greeks are smart. They've got an answer to solve this stuff. To solve this problem of the scarcity of food, what the Greek polises began to do is set up colonies. There we are. They set up colonies. And they set these colonies up along the Black Sea, along the Mediterranean Sea. And any Greek polis that set up a colony was referred to as a mother city, or as Superman might say, a metropolis. Yeah, in Greek, metropolis just means mother city. Metra meaning mother, polis meaning city. I think you get the point. The purpose of these colonies was to grow grains, things like wheat and barley for bread and other food crops to feed the polis. It's the food they desperately need for their growing populations. By 550 BC, as we can see from the map here, Greek colonies could be found from one end of the Mediterranean Sea to the other. Modern-day countries like Spain, France, Italy, Turkey, parts of Egypt, the Balkan Peninsula, all over the place, you're seeing Greek influence. So Greek culture becomes really the dominant cultural influence in the ancient world. And the reason is because of all this colonization, cultural diffusion is taking place. Cultural diffusion, if you don't know, boys and girls, is simply defined as the exchange of goods, ideas, and customs among different cultures. You have to come in contact with someone. You see, when these Greeks, when they go to other parts of the ancient world, they don't just travel with their clothes on their back and their boats and their farming tools. They bring with them their culture, their language, their religion, their building styles, their military tactics, their writing, and they create what are basically these outposts of Greek culture all over the ancient world. And so for this reason, Greek becomes the region's most powerful cultural influence, influencing everyone from the Romans to the eastern and southeastern portions of the Mediterranean Sea region. Greek becomes a powerful cultural influence as a result. And so with all this influx of food crops now coming from the colonies, a lot of those little farmers back home on mainland Greece decide to stop growing them. It's just not profitable anymore because the grain coming in from the colonies was cheap, so they couldn't make any money growing that stuff back home. So they switched to growing cash crops. What are cash crops? Cash crops are just any crops that you grow in order to sell just to make a profit. Think cotton in the Old South prior to the American Civil War. Now, the most important and profitable of these cash crops for the Greeks were olives for olive oil and grapes for wine. These were a huge part of the Greek diet, but they were also a huge part of the Greek economy because these cash crops and their byproducts could be exported to other colonies, to other countries, or to different city-states. There's big money to be made here. These made huge profits for the mainland farmers, but they also made tremendous amounts of wealth for each polis as well. Good economic times, what can we say? But I don't want to paint this rosy picture that the money is freely flowing and everyone's getting a piece of this, because not all the mainland farmers were so fortunate. Most mainland farmers were small family farms, and they could only afford to live from harvest to harvest. And so in a lot of cases, these small family farms had to take out loans in order to survive the year until the next harvest time. And who are the only people wealthy enough to give out these loans? Well, that'd be the aristocracy. And in exchange for these loans, they expected the farmers to put up collateral. Well, the only thing these farmers have to put up as collateral is their land. So to get the loans, the farmers put up their fields as collateral. And when they can't pay back the loans, which, by the way, happened a lot, these farmers would lose their land. Now think about what that means, farmers losing their land. You remember what one of the standards of citizenship was? It was land ownership. So loss of land for these small farmers also meant loss of citizenship. A lot of these farmers ended up having to become sharecroppers or day laborers in the cities. Worst of all, some even sold themselves or their children into temporary slavery just to pay off their debts. Not pretty. And as you could imagine, common farmers in Greece were pretty unhappy with the trend of their economic situation. As such, they demanded that the government of their polises make immediate reforms to rectify the problem. But who are the people who hold power in the polis? That's the aristocracy. And who's profiting from this economic situation? That's the aristocracy. So you think anything's going to change? I don't think so. Ultimately, this leads to uprisings, revolts, general political upheaval in many parts of Greece, all because of this bad economic situation. But fear not, things ultimately will change for our common farmers, and the change would come from the least likely of sources. It's a military tactic. The change would come from this new military tactic called the phalanx. Now, the phalanx is a new military tactic that involved the use of rows and rows and rows of foot soldiers, all arrayed in tight formation with their shields forming a wall. And in the old militaries, remember, cavalry was more important. But now, all of a sudden, with this new military tactic, the common farmer becomes more valuable as a foot soldier than the aristocrat and his cavalry. And so the commoners are able to parlay this military tactic and their newfound importance into greater freedoms, greater political rights, and political reforms. Now, let's not pretend that this all happened overnight. The struggle is going to continue for years, but ultimately the reforms and the newfound freedoms would culminate with a new kind of government that we like to call democracy. So back to those essential questions. What did we look at here today? The polis. We tried to define what it is. What is a polis? What are some of its basic characteristics? We saw the Greek polises establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean Sea region. But why did they do this? Why did they establish those colonies? And how did those colonies lead to the spread of Greek culture and language throughout the Mediterranean region? Finally, we saw some economic problems that emerged. These problems led to struggle and conflict between the aristocracy and the common people. How did that happen? And then this military tactic would be introduced that would sort of bring reforms and greater rights and freedoms. The phalanx. What was the phalanx? How did this tactic help the common people gain greater political rights? And folks, be ready to discuss all of these topics the next time that we meet. And until then, I bid you farewell.